Well, good afternoon, and thanks for coming to another one of our TESS seminars. We're sort of working our way through the first third of the semester so far. Just wanted to say quickly, TESS we sort of pride ourselves on our academic impact and various ways that you can measure that. But we've obviously done very well if you went to the TESS retreat in terms of total numbers of citations and high impact publications, that type of thing. And there's various other things that we could talk about, but I just wanted to mention some news I got today is that David Edwards, who was a postdoc here for 3, maybe 4 years, has now accepted a full tenured professorship at the University of Cambridge. It doesn't get any better than that in academia. It's just fantastic. We also had Nandini Velio, who was also offered a postdoc at Cambridge, but ultimately took one at Columbia University, another luminary institution. Anyway, we're connecting with some very good places, and just wanted to let you know that little bit of news. Thanks.
So good afternoon, everybody. It's with pleasure and some trepidation that I introduce Jayden, our speaker today, Jayden Engert. Jayden is a third-year PhD student. And I'm just discussing with him how it'd be nice if we finished this year, because there's a big difference in how much money you earn between PhD student and first-year postdoc. But so I'm very happy to introduce him, and his talk today is on nature conservation being compromised by agricultural interests in Australia. And I did want to say, so Jayden isn't an ecologist, despite my efforts to push him along that vein. I guess I would see him, as I was asking him, do you see yourself as a conservation scientist or a spatial analyst? And he said, well, I try to tread the line between the two. So anyway, that gives you some perspective of his interests.
Thanks for the introduction, Sue. So yeah, I'm going to be talking today about some work that I recently finished, but started a while ago, looking at how agricultural interests influence conservation of Australia's threatened species. This is work that was led by Vanessa Adams at Uni of TAS and Bob Cressy, as well as a whole bunch of other people. And I took the spatial analyst role because, as Sue said, that's kind of what I do. So we were looking at how agriculture and productive lands influence conservation in Australia, because productive lands such as agriculture and pastoral lands are the biggest drivers of habitat loss and land cover change and land degradation globally. And that's particularly true for Australia. And because of that, they're also one of the main threats to a whole bunch of species, and in particular, threatened species. And because agricultural lands are important for sustaining human populations, lots of the times when land planning and spatial planning is happening, agricultural uses are prioritized and conservation kind of comes second to that. And what that often ends up in is we are conserving the land that we wouldn't be impacting anyway. Things like steep slopes, rocky outcrops, stuff out in the middle of the desert, things like that. And in Australia, about more than 50% of the landmass is under some sort of use for primary production. That is, about 15% is intensive agriculture or intensive pasture, things that require complete removal or complete transformation of the vegetation. There's also a lot of grazing of native pastures, which I'm not going to be discussing so much today. But all of this sort of agricultural conversion lands are concentrated in the south and the eastern parts of Australia. And that also overlaps the areas that have the highest species richness and the highest threatened species richness. And on the other hand, nature conservation and Indigenous land tenures are all kind of chucked out in the middle of nowhere in the land that we didn't really want to use for anything anyway. And Australia has a lot of threatened species. I think probably everyone here knows that we are one of the worst countries in the world for biodiversity declines and threatened species. The species of national environmental significance list is currently about 2,100, I think, species, but that doesn't include species that are threatened or endangered locally and regionally. And there's a lot more species that come under that banner, but I didn't find good maps for them, so I'm not really going to talk about them after this point. But again, many studies have shown that for the vast majority of Australia's threatened species, the biggest impact is habitat loss and fragmentation, and therefore habitat protection and restoration are the biggest recovery tools. And the way that we think about threatened species and deliver those recovery tools and those conservation actions is very variable between species. There's lots of differences between, say, charismatic species like this baby numbat here, in the amount of conservation attention it would get compared to this snail, which is also threatened, that has much lower amounts of conservation funding and just attention in general. But also species conservation actions are dependent on if the conservation actions are more expensive or cheaper, or if they could be controversial. So things like culling brumbies in Kosciuszko, that's a constant source of controversy. So maybe we're not being as efficient with those conservation actions as possible. And also, if a species lives on land that we want to use, it gets a lot less conservation attention in form of meaningful protection and stuff like that, not just like local protection of small clusters of species. And of course, the current key example of that is the black-throated finch, which is kind of just getting pushed to extinction because it likes to live on land that is full of coal. So with all of this information, production lands are biggest drivers of habitat loss. They're also very important, so they subsede conservation lands in land planning, and threatened species receive variable amounts of protection and conservation actions depending on a whole bunch of different aspects. That led us to two sort of key questions for this work that I'm discussing, which is, do the species that live in productive habitats experience more habitat loss and receive less protection? And do species get conserved in the parts of their habitat or the parts of their range that are less useful for productive uses? And the first key part of that, which was my job as a geospatial technician, I guess, was to create an agricultural capability map for all of Australia. And that included harmonizing a bunch of existing maps, creating new maps from scratch, such as for Victoria, who had published a report on how they would create a map, but never actually did it. And also combining a whole bunch of different, very crop-specific maps. So for, I think, South Australia, I combined the capability maps for about 30 single crop species into one map that was just a general map of land capability. And we also filled some gaps in the big unproductive areas out in the middle of Australia using a grazing suitability map. So this is kind of a visual representation of that. I talked a bit too much on the other slide, but this is a really pretty figure that took me a day to make, so I'm just going to leave it there for a bit. As you can see, there's lots of gaps in, sorry, figuring this out. So for example, Western Australia, Northern Territory, South Australia, we have big gaps in where they just didn't map because they knew those areas were not super productive. And that's where we've built with the just general grazing capability map. So there is some limitations on the precision of this map in those grazing lands, in the rangelands. But even if you look at satellite imagery maps of Australia, you can tell that that is pretty much unproductive land all through there. And so there are existing agricultural suitability and capability maps. So why did we bother to go to this big effort to make this one? Well, a lot of the existing ones don't consider things like soil quality or soil type or local topography, whereas ours does. And also because a lot of these maps were taken from jurisdictional or state level mapping, they are very refined to specific jurisdiction crop types. So we're not trying to map like the suitability of soy or rice or anything in areas that wouldn't grow that crop anyway. And it also supports a whole bunch of different production types. So apart from agriculture, there's also grazing, forestry, things like that. And we made this nice big map, which has 8 different capability classes. And I'm just going to summarize high capability is what I'm going to be talking about today, and that is the land that is good for intensive production, so cropping, horticulture, intensive pasture, and requires little to no modifications or management. And we also have moderate capability, which you can do a bit of agriculture, but it takes a lot of inputs or management, and low capability, which is pretty much native grazing or nothing, or forestry. And we did a whole bunch of different validation things to see, because this map is mostly just built on government reports and satellite data, does it actually correlate with things that we can measure on the ground? I'm not going to talk about all the validation, but essentially the map does a pretty good idea of saying where productive lands are and what lands are likely to be used as production lands. So the agricultural and pastoral land uses are predominantly located in high to moderate capability lands, and high capability land is almost always in either agriculture or pasture, compared to like your low value lands that are always in the non-productive uses like conservation. And it's also a pretty solid predictor of land clearing. So we based this on the NVIS vegetation clearing data. And we found that just our agricultural map on its own explains about 37% of the deviance in what land is cleared and what land isn't. And you can tell from this map here, this is only showing land that has been cleared, and you can see that it's very green. Not a lot of the low capability stuff in there. So the four research questions that we have been answered, that I will discuss, I guess, is habitat protection constrained only by past land clearing, or is it also constrained by the suitability for future land clearing? Do the species whose habitat is good for agriculture experience more loss and less protection? Are species only protected in the parts of the range that are less suitable for agriculture? And assuming these things are true, can we use our agricultural capability map to identify areas and species that are going to be at risk of future land clearing? So also, I'll just give a quick summary of the analysis that we did. It was pretty much a lot of big overlay analysis and then summarizing that data. So we looked at the agricultural capability map, of course, plus the threatened species ranges from the Species of National Environmental Significance database, as well as protected areas and cleared land. And we modeled the relationship between agricultural capability and land in habitat loss or habitat protection. And we also looked at the values of the agricultural capability in protected and unprotected parts of species ranges. But when I actually get to those slides, there'll be a bit more clear explanation of the methods. So with the habitat protection and land clearing, this was analysis that Vanessa Adams led. And she did a path analysis, which you develop a qualitative idea of how you think the model is going to pan out. And then it tells you how well your idea predicts what actually happened. So it's a stepwise kind of analysis rather than just putting everything in and seeing what correlates. And what it showed was that the land is cleared first because that is, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button on this thing. So the strongest sort of relationship here is between high capability land and land clearing. So high capability land is cleared or left unprotected for future clearing. And then that also determines, based on that, that determines what areas become protected. So you can see even when we're talking about like current protection, it is still influenced by the land capability. There is still not much effort to protect those high value lands. So to analyze the actual impacts for individual species, because a lot of the idea of land being protected and cleared based on land capability is not a super new concept. What I'm talking about is how do those impacts pan out at the individual species level and determine which species get more or less impacted. So for all of these species, we did a big overlay where I looked at across their range, what percentage of the range is high value agricultural land, what percent of the range has been cleared, and what percentage of the range has been protected. And then we can use that to model the influence of high value land on protection and clearing. So using like a beta regression, we can see that the percentage of land that, percentage of species range that has high agricultural value is a strong predictor of how much habitat that species loses and how much of its habitat is protected. Of course, species that have land that's very good for agriculture get very little protection, often much less than 17%, and species that have poor quality land get a lot of protection. And anyone who's seen the protected area maps of Australia with all the protected areas out in the middle of the desert would understand that pretty easily. But there is a difference in that relationship between different taxonomic groups. For example, birds and frogs lose more habitat than other species for the same percentage of high value land. For birds, that's probably because they usually have large ranges, so it's probably just some sort of thing based on range size. But for frogs, something to do with water availability, maybe. And also reptiles get less protection based on the land cover, which I don't know the exact reason for that. If anyone works with reptiles, let me know and I'll put it in my discussion. But then the thing that I was most interested in actually was looking at the location of protected areas within species ranges. And for a lot of this, I'm going to be using the mahogany glider as an example because it's a very clear-cut difference between what part of their habitat is protected and what part is not protected and cleared. So by breaking the range down, we can separate out the protected land and the unprotected land, and then compare the value distributions just using a basic chi-square test. And you can see that the agricultural capability of its protected habitat is much, much lower than the agricultural capability of its unprotected habitat. So mahogany gliders have pretty much lost all of the habitat that is high value for agriculture, and they're only protected on like rocky outcrops and slopes on the edge of their range. And when we do this analysis for all the, 500 threatened species that I looked at, you can see that the vast majority of them are protected in the parts of their habitat that are lower value for agriculture. And there's actually a few species that are protected in areas that are higher value. Not sure, that's probably just some sort of random thing. But this trend is consistent across all groups. So pretty much the vast majority of species in Australia are protected in the parts of the range that aren't good for agriculture. And then we can use this sort of information to develop risk maps. And for this, I just made a simple definition of land that is at risk of future clearing. And that is land that has high value for agriculture, hasn't been cleared yet, and isn't under any sort of formal protection in a protected area or like land management scheme. And then we can look at how this correlates with state boundaries and federal electorate boundaries, and of course the threatened species ranges. And we can see that most of this at-risk land is in Queensland, Northern Territory and New South Wales. And anyone who knows Australia's land clearing policies would be a bit alarmed by that because Queensland and New South Wales have got pretty atrocious land clearing policies historically and still today. And a lot of that land is in areas that have also already experienced a lot of land clearing to date. So they're not really known for having strong land clearing policies either. And there's also a lot of areas that could be at risk in the future in Northern Australia as part of all these big developing the Northern Australia white papers, things like the Ord River development, stuff like that. So electorates like Lingiari and Kennedy have a lot of this land that could be at risk in the future. But this is just based on agricultural capability. We didn't include anything else like distance to cities or anything like that. So just bear that in mind. And we can also look at the threatened species ranges. And what we find is that most species don't have a lot of land that is still at risk of clearing because most of the species whose land is high value have already lost most of their habitat. And most of the species and the other species, most of their range is low value. So there's not much that would be considered at risk. But there is 24 species that were at risk of having more land clearing off across a total of 10% of their range. So they could still lose thousands to millions of hectares of habitat from agricultural land clearing. And 4 of the species that have the greatest threat based on this, I think all 4 of them were at risk across more than 50% of their range, and they're endemic to the Melville Islands in the Northern Territory. And at the moment, there are proposals, I guess, or schemes to try and develop the Tiwi Islands, and Melville Island is part of the Tiwi Island. So those 4 species could be significantly impacted by these schemes. And an example there is the black-footed tree rat. And there's also 17 species who currently haven't lost half of the vegetation in their range, but under this agricultural expansion, they could lose, they could end up having more than half of their land cleared if all these at-risk areas end up being cleared at some point. So to summarize these results, agricultural capability heavily influences both the location of land clearing and habitat protection, and that's not only historically, that's also ongoing. And species, of course, lose more habitat and receive less protection when their habitat is good for agriculture or other productive uses. Species are predominantly protected in the parts of their range that are not good for agriculture, and future agricultural land clearing is a significant threat for many threatened species. So why do we care that much about what part of a species range is good for agriculture and what isn't? And does that actually translate to any impacts for the species, or is that just a land clearing kind of issue that is unrelated to species ecology? Well, there is evidence for a bunch of species that they are more abundant in high productivity habitat. So that means that if we are only protecting species in the parts of their habitat that are less productive, they might be being protected in areas that don't support high local abundance. They might act as sink habitat, or it might just be marginal where the species can't really survive long term, even if that habitat is protected. And this is something that has been observed in a whole bunch of species around the world. There was actually a more recent paper came out the other week showing that many of the most important threatened species are being protected in habitat that would be considered marginal for that species based on a pre-European baseline kind of thing. So this is not just a land clearing issue. These could have a real impact on species persistence long term if we're only protecting the stuff that has the lowest agricultural value. And a lot of these species that are being protected in these marginal habitats are decreasing in population size, even in the presence of conservation actions. And one example of that is the mahogany glider from our data, which is all of its highly productive habitat has been cleared through the Tully region, all that sort of area has all been converted to sugarcane and stuff like that. And a lot of analysis have shown that they're actually more common in little patches and trees within farmland than they are in the rocky outcrops of their habitat that are protected. And this is from a paper from Erin from Townsville, who's doing her PhD on the mahogany gliders. You can see that the area where they have the highest predicted abundance is the area that is high quality for agriculture here. So there is probably some sort of relationship for mahogany gliders specifically to give evidence that they are more abundant in the high value areas that are most at risk. And currently, even though they are still declining within their protected areas, there are no plans to restore or protect this high value agricultural habitat. Most of the recovery plans for the mahogany glider is about restoring connectivity and stuff like that. And so if we're talking about this agricultural capability map, is it really a good proxy for land that is at risk of future clearing? I mean, Australia is supposed to have land clearing regulations, so how much does the agricultural capability on its own affect that? Well, Australia is one of the global leaders in land clearing, especially in Queensland and New South Wales. And the vast majority of land clearing in, I think it was at least Queensland, based on Michelle Ward's study, is not referred to the EPBC Act or doesn't go through any sort of federal regulation. And the industry that is one of the worst at referring its land clearing is agriculture. So a lot of this land that is at risk of being cleared for agriculture isn't really actually subjected to any federal regulations, and the state regulations are often very weak. And okay, yeah, so we're only looking at agricultural capability when we make these risk maps. We're not considering distance to cities, distance to roads, anything like that. But there has been a trend lately of expansion of large-scale industrial agricultural areas that are independent of populated areas. So things like the food estates in Indonesia and Papua and Kalimantan that get a lot of attention, plus things like the Ord River, which has undergone a massive conversion from because of large-scale irrigation and conversion for industrial agriculture. And this is an area that is very low population density. It's not really too close to any big cities or anything like that. So with the increasing urbanized population, there's going to be a trend away from sort of subsistence, localized agriculture around population centers and towards more of these large-scale agricultural projects that can impact species irrespective of the local population density or anything like that. All right, so some caveats for this analysis is that we're only looking at the complete removal of vegetation or complete transformation, but there's also, of course, a lot of impacts from modification and degradation through grazing and things like that. But that's a bit harder to model because it happens all over the arid regions of Australia. So a lot of these threatened species may be impacted by grazing, but that's not captured by the analysis that I've done here. And we're only looking, when we're talking about the land that is at risk, we're only talking about land that has high value for agriculture. But of course, there is clearing for things like forestry and mining and stuff like that. While it has a much smaller land clearing rate, it is particularly threatening for like restricted range species or species that are locally abundant within areas that are good for forestry. So a lot of attention on koalas and stuff lately. And what else? And also there is a decent amount of agricultural development on moderate capability lands, especially in Australia, because we only have a fairly small amount of very high value land. So there is also a decent amount of agricultural development on these moderate lands, and that is also not captured in the future risk sort of category for this analysis. So to conclude, all the things that I have said about 4 times already, so probably don't need to hear it again, but land capability shapes the land clearing and habitat protection for the whole continent and for threatened species in particular. And species that live in productive environments suffer the most from clearing and are likely to get the least further expansion of protection under protected area schemes, unless we make these politically challenging decisions of protecting land that could be used for agriculture. And also because species are being protected in the parts of their range that are less productive or less conducive to agricultural uses, we might only be protecting marginal habitats. So that is also another reason that we should be considering putting some of these high value lands under some form of protection. And you can use this map to look at areas and species at risk of future impacts if you want. It's published now, so go for it. Thank you.